Started. Welcome everybody to the Unlearning series second session. Today we're going to be talking about placemaking as a transformative act. Our first session we had around a month ago, and if you follow the link bit.ly/CAED Unlearning, we have a recording as well as links to the resources that this presentation is based off of and our previous presentation was based off of. And Soham, I think you wanted to take it from here just for this slide.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a chance. If you've read a little bit about the Unlearning series, it's about talking about our profession and our education. And also want to take a moment and contextualize and talk about why what we're doing is important. So yesterday there was a peaceful protest organized by BIPOC youth in response to the statements from the SLO County Sheriff of how racism doesn't exist in SLO County and how he doesn't think systemic racism exists. And to quote that he can't experience prejudice, but he knows prejudice when people hate him for the uniform he wears. This is a dangerous thing to think because he's conflating a job with race and a state of being. And so BIPOC students and young people organized a peaceful protest yesterday at Mitchell Park. They marched through downtown, returned to Mitchell Park, and after the protest had, for most parts, disbanded, people were on their way home, 15 cop cars showed up and detained 15 protesters and then arrested 3 protesters and booked them at the SLO County Jail. Of them, Tiana Arata was included. Tiana has been monumental in organizing our protests for the Black Lives Matter movement here in SLO. Thankfully, we were able to get her out on bail. She was released at 3 a.m. this morning, but other protesters still remain and they're being charged with 5 violent crimes of organizing and whatnot. And I encourage you to read on news media's explanations of the events, and not just news, but also personal accounts, because there's been claims of violence against cars running over protesters. And so if you would like to help out, there is a bail fund being organized for the city of San Luis Obispo through the Democratic Socialist Association of SLO. And so there's a Cash App and a PayPal. You can also visit their Instagram, DSA_SLO, for more information and to find out how to support. And if you're in the San Luis Obispo area and you feel comfortable, there will also be a peaceful sit-in with no intentions to march at the San Luis Obispo County Courthouse today at 4 p.m. Bring signs, wear your mask, bring water. The intention is to call out the way that the protesters were handled last night. They were not read their Miranda rights and they were not explained for why they were being being arrested. We only knew about the charges against the protesters afterwards from statements from the SLO County Sheriff. So if you are comfortable and you want to support the movement, feel free to find more information at these sources. Thanks, Natalie.
Of course, thank you for taking care of that. I really wish I were in SLO right now. I'm just going to give a little recap about our first session. So why Unlearning? The Unlearning series is a series of discussions throughout the summer that aim to question our practices in education in the built environment. So basically, we're learning how to look at things critically, especially in terms of course material, our assignments and lectures, especially when they leave out important histories and perspectives of marginalized people and their culture. The first step to eradicating systemic racism and injustice is to learn how our disciplines have supported systemic racism and injustice. Our hope with this series is to not only learn about our failures to build an inclusive environment, but also learn what principles we can ingrain in our work to ensure inclusivity. So we learned historical examples about how the built environment right now does not value people, it values material, and we talked about how we can begin to value people, communities, and humanity by 1, being a citizen expert, 2, being a storyteller, and 3, building community. So today we're learning about how transformative placemaking takes those 3 Bs and puts them into action in the built environment. Transformative placemaking is all about being a leader who is a citizen expert. It is essentially prioritizing community input to create meaningful change within a space to reflect the needs and values of the people actually living there. And something I want to add here is that placemaking is a term typically used when talking about urban developments, but the concept itself is also super relevant in other areas, such as when you're helping develop a workplace environment, when you're trying to create an inclusive college campus, and anything regarding a public space that people will be inhabiting. Placemaking is all about prioritizing the people's best interests in the environment. And I also want to emphasize the importance of amplifying marginalized voices in the planning process. It all starts by recognizing the potential in people. If we're not investing in Black and Brown people, then we can always figure out ways to invest in place and not people. This is from Andre Perry. It's a quote from the video "What is Transformative Placemaking," which is found at CAED. It's found at bit.ly/CAED Unlearning. This is my favorite quote out of the entire video. Transformative placemaking came out as a new way of leading, planning, and designing. Oftentimes when there are revitalization projects, the development is investing in the buildings and not the communities that live on that land. Placemaking itself is a common concept already, but the transformative aspect was added to address the needs to enhance Black and Brown voices in the creation of places. You simply cannot create a place where people feel they belong without consulting with first and getting the consent of the community you're building in. It's so important to remember that we build places for the community and that we cannot claim to do so if we do not include the entirety of the people there. So this is a screenshot from the documentary A Village Called Versailles. Versailles is a small village in New Orleans East, and their story can be found on Canopy. It's linked down here in the PowerPoint. And basically it's an example of when planners, architects, and developers leave people out of the process of creating new spaces. We can directly cause the displacement of communities and their lack of accessibility to basic needs such as shelter, food, and sense of belonging. So this specific graphic was created by the Urban Land Institute. Yes, thank you for the link. And it was an organization that was brought in to help rebuild New Orleans post-Katrina. And in the documentary, we follow the story of a community, Versailles, comprised of mostly Vietnamese refugees who were devastated by the hurricane. And when they attended the community meeting where the Urban Land Institute unveiled their redevelopment plan, not only was the majority of New Orleans East seen here designated to become green space, but also the entirety of Versailles was left out of the plan. And it just begs the question, like, where are the rest of the people who used to live here going to go if this is supposed to be green space? And how is Versailles put into all of this if they're not even put into the plan for redevelopment? Later in the documentary, it's revealed that they were left out because they were going to become home to a landfill for the hurricane debris, which included toxic materials that directly harmed the community. In the documentary, the residents of Versailles stated that they were never asked what the recovery rate is or how many people have returned, and that they felt that planners had disregarded an entire group of people who were needing help. And instead, they were prioritizing the creation of a lush environment, and they sacrificed 60% of the city's landmass and the people who lived there in the process. So before you have places of belonging, you must feel you belong. This is a quote from Placemaking and the Politics of Belonging and Disbelonging by Roberto Bedoya. He writes that before there's a vibrant street, one first needs to understand the social dynamics on that street, which are the politics of belonging and disbelonging. The significance of this quote is that so many BIPOC and immigrants today do not feel like they belong in the US and at Cal Poly. And if you're going into the field of developing the built environment, you have the power to change that through transformative placemaking by prioritizing the creation of a place for the people over design and over profit. It's important to be aware of the politics of belonging and disbelonging at work, meaning that when we create places we must be very cognizant to how society has made people feel they do not belong historically, such as the village of Versailles in New Orleans. We must be a storyteller. By using our knowledge of a community, by being a citizen expert, we are responsible for sharing that knowledge and spreading awareness to the injustice, while also sharing stories of those who have made change. Transformative placemaking entails meaningful changes in the built environment, which transform a place to include more of the public than it did traditionally. An example on campus would be all gender restrooms and providing free tampons and pads in both binary gender restrooms. While in the past, historically, non binary folk have been marginalized and felt like they have to choose a place to belong, by creating all gender restrooms, it includes that portion of the public and feels like they belong in the public space. The public space is inherently multidimensional. This is from Placemaking. What if we built our cities around places by the Project for Public Spaces? Essentially, what this is saying here is how essential intersectionality is when you're trying to create places for people. When creating a public space, it's important to remember who will be using it and how best to make all people with all social identities feel welcome. This includes anything from inclusive seating for people with disabilities, or to having cultural night markets for community members to celebrate and share their culture with another. So most of us do know this image at Cal Poly. Personally, my connection is that my older sister and now fiance, who are Muslim, walked past this wall on their way to college a lot, and there were a lot of Islamophobic rhetoric and slurs that they had to face while being on campus. It was a moment of awakening for the campus, beginning to realize the racist culture that Cal Poly has allowed to foster, and realize who was allowing it to perpetuate by failing to recognize the issue. The outcome of this exhibit is an instance which shows the need for transformative placemaking in our own community. When building things and putting things into an environment, we must remain cognizant of the ways it can exclude and hurt others. This graphic is also based from placemaking. What if we built our cities around places from the Project for Public Spaces? And basically what it's supposed to convey is that there are so many things that go into a place, making it impossible for one individual or one group to foster an inclusive environment alone. The first key principle written in the placemaking guidebook is the community is the expert, meaning that the first step in placemaking is understanding the people's values, needs, and talents. And in transformative placemaking, we take it one step further by intentionally supporting the voices of underrepresented, marginalized people in the community. And so now that's the concluding of the presentation. And something that I want to put in before we start the discussion, I think we're going to break up into some breakout rooms. But before we go, I really want to challenge everybody, including myself, to be uncomfortable and be in the space to ask questions and hold discussion. Make sure that you're trying your best to stay involved in the group that you get put into. If you feel safe in doing so, please unmute your mic or stop your video. But other than that, just know that it's completely acceptable to also just use the chat if you feel more comfortable with that. Yeah, and just take a moment and think about what the presentation brought up for you and try to connect it with what kind of things we can do today in our space right now as Cal Poly students. So breakout rooms, let's see.
Yeah, and while Natalie's preparing the breakout rooms, hopefully it ends up that there's at least one member from each of our committees. And so I'm going to stop recording just because we're going to only record the presentation part of this.